Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting and, well, sometimes quite intense discussion. It's from a YouTube video with Alex Phillips.
Right. The source is the Andrew Gold Heretics channel. It's known for looking into some sensitive areas.
Exactly. And this video, Andrew Gold is talking with Alex Phillips. It's about her documentary and, data around migration, crime, really in the UK, but also parts of Europe.
Yeah, so our aim here in this deep dive is really to pull out the main arguments, the key insights from their chat.
We'll be looking at how they read the crime stats,
Yep.
especially those linked to people born outside the UK.
And also what they suggest about cultural factors maybe driving migration and the sort of wider societal stuff they get into.
It's about understanding their perspective based on what they discussed in that video. We're reporting on their conversation.
Okay, so first big topic. Crime statistics, where do they start?
Well, they touch on media coverage of crime generally, but then they quickly zoom in on some very specific data, linking crimes and the nationality of the people involved.
And they stress, don't they, that this isn't just anecdotal. They're pointing to official government sources.
Yeah, Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, the UK, Western European countries. That's where they say the data's from.
And the key finding they highlight from this data is, well, it's quite stark.
It is. They say the statistical chance of someone born outside the country being the perpetrator of a severe sexual offense.
It's significantly higher. They mention about 4 times higher in some places compared to the native-born population.
Crucially, though, they're not talking about all foreign-born people. It's a specific trend they identified in the data for that kind of crime.
And they drill down even more, right, into nationalities.
They do. The conversation points to a pattern, they say, in the data they looked at, where individuals from Muslim countries are overrepresented in those specific stats for severe sexual offenses.
That becomes a really central point for them.
Which naturally leads to questions about, how easy is it to get this data? How is it being interpreted?
They do mention that in the video, that getting hold of these specific stats wasn't straightforward at first.
And they also talk about the pushback they got, like common questions.
What about white guys committing crimes? Or are these British people with Pakistani backgrounds or actually born elsewhere? Things like that.
Exactly. They address those. They acknowledge crime happens across all groups, obviously.
But their focus stays on what they say the statistics show about the probability being different for certain foreign-born groups regarding these specific severe offenses.
And to give a UK example, they bring up that figure. Around 1 in 4 people in UK prisons for sexual offenses were born outside the UK.
Which, when you compare it to the overall percentage of the population that's foreign-born, well, it's lower than 25%.
So that raises a question of proportionality. That's what they highlight.
And the documentary itself, the motivations seem to be moving past just lived experience.
Right, presenting what they see as empirical evidence for these observations from the crime data.
And they also suggest maybe that's why there hasn't been a huge hit back against the documentary's findings, because it's research-led, in their view.
Okay, so shifting slightly. The video then explores potential cultural factors. Why, according to them, might some migrant men choose the UK specifically?
A key argument they make is about cultural differences, big ones, particularly around views on women.
They contrast modern Western views with attitudes they say are common in some Muslim cultures. Veiling is one example they use.
And then there's this quite striking claim about people traffickers.
Yeah, alleging there are TikTok videos advertising the UK to young men.
Specifically showing things like girls on nights out in Essex, apparently. The idea being that the freedom and visibility of women is part of the sell.
Which connects to their anecdotal observations about where migrants often want to end up.
They mention hearing preferences for Germany, the UK, Denmark, Sweden, rather than, say, Southern European countries.
And they speculate why. Maybe better welfare systems, but also, more controversially, what they call the allure of the exotic women.
This then leads into a discussion about religious interpretations.
The concept of 72 virgins in some Islamic interpretations gets brought up.
As a potential factor influencing how some men might view women, they even suggest these traditional teachings could be a much bigger concern than someone like Andrew Tate.
Okay, so this brings us onto that really charged term, Islamophobia and fear.
They challenge the term itself in the video, arguing Islam is a belief system, not a race, not a country.
They mention that incident with Michael Fabricant and Trisha Goddard.
We're suggesting adapting to UK norms got framed as Islamophobia. They use it to question automatically labeling concerns as prejudice.
And they look at the word phobia, irrational fear, versus Concerns, they argue, stem from actions, things like terrorism or grooming gangs,
And they voice opposition to the idea of a legal definition of Islamophobia, which the Labor government was considering.
suggesting that, well, in their view, maybe fear of Islam isn't entirely without reason.
They do tackle the point that extremists aren't the majority, right?
Yeah, using an analogy, a woman might feel fear walking alone at night, but that doesn't mean she fears all men. It's about perceived risk in a situation.
There are personal stories shared too, feeling unsafe at night.
And observations about people in a London neighborhood seeming, quote, fresh off the boat.
Which highlights how people make quick assumptions, maybe based on appearance or body language, for personal safety. It's a human thing, they argue.
And linking back to the crime stats again, they mention this rise in sexual attacks in the UK, a quadrupling, they cite, over 10 years.
And they suggest a connection to changing migration patterns, specifically from the developing world, from countries with different cultural norms regarding women, in their view.
And they contrast this, don't they, with earlier immigration.
Yeah, like from Eastern Europe in the early 2000s. They claim similar levels of concern weren't really there back then.
Okay, so then the conversation moves towards social integration, or the challenges to it, and cultural preservation.
They point to the obvious potential barriers: language differences, cultural practices, religious views, all making integration harder sometimes.
And economic factors, too. They suggest migrants can maybe function economically without fully integrating now
How so?
because of technology, maybe welfare support, and established communities of people from the same background.
Right. They use that analogy of English expats in China tending to stick together. It's a natural human tendency, maybe.
They also touch on economic crises, potentially making social divisions worse.
And they use a historical parallel, a pretty stark one: Indigenous Americans and European colonization, to illustrate potential negative outcomes of big demographic shifts for the existing population.
Staying historical, but more recent, they discuss Christians leaving Middle Eastern countries.
And the persecution they sometimes face in Muslim-majority areas, which they then link to the history of Jews being forced out of the Middle East and how that relates to Israel now.
And they even mention Jewish people leaving Britain more recently, framing it as a kind of red flag for society.
They also mention tensions within the UK itself, examples like Muslims reportedly attacking Hindus and Sikhs.
And some anecdotal observations about Birmingham. Cultural changes, issues like litter, which they link to a perceived lack of ownership or loyalty among some groups.
Then there's the whole halal slaughter debate. Ethical concerns, particularly around priest stunning. They compare it briefly to kosher practices.
Which broadens out into wider points about animal welfare and food waste, reflecting societal values.
And finally, in this part, they get onto UK food security.
Yeah, the reliance on imports, vulnerabilities shown up by the pandemic, global events.
They contrast it with China trying to be more self-sufficient in agriculture.
And mention the attacks on shipping routes, the geopolitical risks, how that could lead to shortages.
And the potential for social unrest if that happened, especially in diverse societies facing blackouts or severe shortages.
So as they near the end of the video, the outlook they present is, well, it's pretty bleak, isn't it?
It is quite pessimistic. They've voiced concerns about demographic trends, the potential for the country's existing culture to be sort of democratically voted out effectively.
And they see the rise of what they call ethno-nationalism as a worrying reaction.
A kind of overreaction to woke multiculturalism, as they put it. They seem worried about extremes on both sides, left and right.
So what do they suggest? Any solutions offered?
Well, they lean towards a more assertive approach to preserving the domestic culture.
Like what?
Prioritizing it, maybe government funding for churches, Church of England schools, things like that.
And other measures, more focused on integration, perhaps?
Yeah, potentially things like insisting public services are in English only, restrictions on face coverings in some places, getting rid of translation services in public bodies.
The idea being?
That if you positively focus on the national culture, people will either integrate or maybe choose to leave if they don't want to.
But they do acknowledge the human cost,
Yeah.
right? Briefly.
Yes, they mention the example of an elderly person, doesn't speak English, needing medical help. What happens then?
And they share personal stories, too, about learning languages when living abroad themselves, kind of contrasting the expectations.
And there's a final anecdote about perceived hypocrisy.
Ah, yes, people criticizing British tourists in Spain for not integrating while maybe advocating for unlimited cultural enrichment back home. That kind of thing.
So if we try and wrap up the main arguments we've heard discussed in their video.
Okay. There were the concerns about crime stats,
Yeah.
specifically severe sexual offenses, and a suggested higher probability for foreign-born individuals from Muslim countries based on the data they presented.
Then the challenges of cultural integration they highlighted, the potential migration motives they discussed, and their take on the term Islamophobia.
Plus, historical and current examples of demographic shifts, worries about food security, social unrest.
And finally, those quite direct potential solutions they floated, centered on prioritizing the national culture.
So it leaves you with a lot to think about. Where is that balance between embracing multiculturalism and preserving a distinct national identity?
Yeah, based on what we've explored from their discussion, what practical steps might be effective but also ethical in navigating all this, it's complex.
And what are the potential long-term consequences of the trends they talked about in the video? Worth considering.
Definitely. We'd encourage you to explore these topics more, look at different perspectives, check out official data yourself.
And if you want to hear the specific viewpoints from our source material directly, you can find that video on the Andrew Gold Heretics YouTube channel. Alex Phillips also has a Substack with more of her writing.